This is Billy Kay, welcoming you to a major new series on the history of Scottish literature. Programme 1, The Flouer o Nationheid.
If you look internationally, Scottish literature has been the defining element of people's perception of Scotland. After all, there are very few countries in the world that have a national day for a poet. And the reputation of Burns around the world became integral to people's perception of what Scottish national identity was.
Barns and Scott, particularly Barns in the 19th and early 20th centuries, have become real cultural icons as a kind of compensation for there not being other institutions, political institutions that people could identify with.
I think there are probably 1,000 stories, 100,000 stories of people being empowered and enabled through literature. And I think in a context where there are so many things ready to damn your identity, I think Scottish literary culture has been massively important.
The grandfather clock coming into this room here has Ramsay, Ferguson, Scott and Burns on it. Is it a tradition that you are proud to belong to?
Very proud. Very proud. I wouldn't presume to put myself in their company, but I'm very proud of that. This is the most wonderful country, and like most of my fellow countrymen, I love it very much. It is my all.
Novelist Alexander McCall Smith and Professors Willie Maley and Murray Pittock of Glasgow University and Cairns Craig of Aberdeen University on what I believe is the most important branch of Scottish culture, the national literary tradition. Yet, it was seldom taught at school, and even those writing in the tradition today realised its relevance later in life. Willie McIlvanney, Alan Bissett and James Robertson.
I had to discover the tradition because it wasn't one that I was familiar with through my education. So it was only when I began to discover this wealth of Scottish literature that I realised that actually I could tap into it and that it was saying things to me that really reached something inside myself. So as soon as I realised that, then yes, it was something that I thought I belonged to this tradition.
What happened after I read Irvine Welsh was I very consciously explored Scottish literature, because I thought, if that book can do this for me, then I'm sure others can. And so you start to develop this depth of feeling and experience based around your home culture.
Willie, do you still use a pencil and a jotter for writing your novels?
Not a pencil, a pen. I still write by hand onto the page, because if it doesn't come out the head, down the arm, onto the paper, I can't quite believe it. So I've never used even a typewriter. It's always been by hand. For me, anyway, it suits the pace of the brain working. I feel that you're slightly carving the words, so it gives me, I think, an awareness of the risk of what I'm doing.
I first interviewed Willie for Edinburgh University's student newspaper in 1973, and I'm sure his jotters were written in pencil. Earlier, his novels had been shared among us sixth-year pupils at Kilmarnock Academy, thrilled to discover a contemporary writer in our midst. Meanwhile, further north in Saltcoats, another gifted writer was discovering the power and the danger of the written word, Janice Galloway.
When I was a teenager, my mother used to go looking for my diary. I'd find my underwear rearranged too neat, and no, sometimes she'd find something she really liked and bring it into the living room as a surprise, recite bits for Myra's benefit while we were watching TV. I was too stupid to stop writing. I just took to hiding it in harder places. She kept finding it. One day, what she read made her burn it. When I came home, she showed me the ashes and said, I could never be trusted again.
Does that reflect any of your own experience starting writing?
Yes, actually. You found this. You would have had to have dug this out of this book. I had forgotten I had written that down. And it was quite a shock to read it. I wrote a novel when I was 11. And my mother lit the fire with it. I remember that. And I was never quite sure if it was because she hadn't realised that I thought this was a kind of important thing for me, or because it was the handiest paper, which is highly likely, or because she disliked the idea. Reading this is making me think she actually disliked the idea of me writing things down. We were a very private family. To write things down was there was a kind of betrayal involved. I didn't write anything down till after my mother had died. My sister was sick. First book came out and I didn't dream of telling her that I had done such a thing as write a book. And she somehow found my publisher's phone number and got in touch with me and threatened to come round and knock my block off for writing things down about the person she called her mother. It was just a scandalous thing, and we never spoke to each other after that.
And we'll return to all of these wonderful writers throughout the series, but to our tale, with Professors Willie Gillis of Edinburgh, Robert Crawford of St Andrews and Alan Reich of Glasgow University, where and when the Scottish literature began.
In the mists of time and prehistory, before people learnt to read and write. It begins with the two essential components of literature, which are storytelling and song. The Orkneyinga saga, for example, an enormous influence on George Mackay Brown, one of the great writers of modern Scotland.
I think Scottish literature has been a great carrier of Scottish identity over the centuries in all sorts of complicated ways because, of course, Scottish literature exists in Latin and Gaelic and Scots and English, little bits of it in Old French and Old Norse. So it's a very complicated, multi-stranded thing.
You could say that the earliest poem in Scotland was in Welsh, the Gododden. This fantastic poem, a poem of fragments of little shards and dark perceptions of brave warriors going into battle who will be killed. You know, where is the son who has been slaughtered on the battlefield a long way from life and the crows are picking out his eyes? It's imagism centuries before imagism was invented. One of the great stories is of Cuchulainn coming from Ireland to the Isle of Skye, to a small promontory off the Isle of Skye called Dunscaith. And you can still go there, you can actually find this place. And that has come through in a wonderful novel by the contemporary writer Janet Paisley, the story about the woman, Scaha, who taught Cuchulainn the arts of war.
From the histories, it appears very often as if somehow Scotland was made by warring men folk. And one wonders, what were the women doing during this time? You know, were they sitting at home doing their knitting? I don't think so. It's never been my experience of Scottish women that they were backward in coming for it.
Warrior Daughter is the name of Janet Paisley's novel. And it's the most violent and the most sexually explicit. I mean, it's a fierce, fierce novel. You know, it's a great book to read.
The old sagas became romances and the romances became tales. And in the modern folk tradition, you find modernised versions of those clinging on even into the 20th century, and some of them were recorded in the School of Scottish Studies recordings in the 1950s and 60s.
The first time I met Iain Crichton Smith was in his house in Tainault. This is the landscape, this is the location of Deirdre and Naoise and those lovers. There, in that landscape, there was that persistent memory in Iain Crichton Smith's imagination that these stories persist. They were present tense.
Other 20th century Highland writers like Neil Gunn and Sorley MacLean would draw from ancient Celtic oral traditions. In the Lowlands, it was the period of the Wars of Independence that gave rise to the first flourishing of great poetry in Scots. Jamie Reid Baxter.
The first great poem that we hae extant is Barbour's Brus. I mean, there is some earlier stuff. The most famous scene, of course, is when Alessander, our king, was deed, that Scotland led in Loch and Lee. Awa was sown so ale and breed, o gamen and glee.
Wine and wax, so gamen and glee. Our gowd was changed into lead. Christ born in virginity, succour Scotland and the mead that is stayed in perplexity. A great summing up of the woes that confronted the nation afore the Wars of Independence.
It's undeniable that a poem like John Barbour's Brus, this great 14th century epic retelling of the story of King Robert the Bruce and with the Battle of Bannockburn at its heart, is a kind of foundation stone in Scottish literature. It's rather wistful singing of the ideal of freedom is something that's lasted. Chalked up on a blackboard in Edinburgh during World War II, freedom is a noble thing. can be seen as championing a universal ideal of freedom.
If you go to that line, freedom is a noble thing, it makes man have liking, you're talking about something that's actually very domestic. The virtues of peace, to be able to take pleasure in trivia, to like things, to have affection for things.
Freedom, all solace to man gives. He leaves at ease that freely leaves. A noble heart may have nain ease na ellis nocht that may him please. Give freedom, feel ye. A famous passage from Barbour's Brus, and a distinguishing feature of the Scottish court was a love of poetry, from James I, who wrote The King is Quare, through to James VI and his poetic coterie, the Castilian Band. John Barbour, too, was close to the king. Ronnie Jack of Edinburgh, Theo van Heinsbergen of Glasgow, and Eric McClure of Aberdeen University.
The kings were patrons of the arts. There was very much the sense that it was to the prestige of the nation to have a flourishing artistic scene. The evidence is that this was commissioned by Robert II, the grandson of Robert Brus, and in all probability, Barbour, the Archdeacon of Aberdeen, a well-known writer and diplomat, wrote this epic poem of the reigning king's great distinguished grandfather as a sort of reminder of what the Scottish monarchy had achieved, what it had been like.
He cuts out all the bits that don't fit in to Brus as a model of freedom. This is overtly an attempt to rank him among the 9 great worthies, to create a 10th worthy. You have the classical worthies, Alexander, Julius Caesar, and Brutus. You have the Jewish worthies, David, Joshua, and Judas Maccabeus. And you have the Christian worthies, Arthur, Charlemagne. And there is a bit of a gap. It's usually filled by Godfrey of Boulogne, but Barbour's intention is to either create a 10th separate one or to put Brus in instead of Godfrey of Boulogne.
So he becomes a hero of Christendom almost.
They had agreed that what their country, what their community needed was a particular kind of history, a usable past, and the cultural and political community could cohere around it.
In his book Bannockburn's Scottish Independence and Literary Imagination, Robert Crawford celebrates the echoes from the period throughout our history, including the lasting effect of Blind Harry's Wallace epic from 1477.
Wounds he had in mony divers place, but fair and weal keep it was his face. Of riches he keep it no proper thing, gave as he won, like Alexander the king. In time of peace, meek as a maid was he. Where war approached, the recht actor was he. The Scots men a great credence he gave, but known enemies they could him noch deceive.
The Wallace is clearly pictured by Blind Harry as a kind of prefigurative worker, preparing the ground, almost like John the Baptist for Christ in a sense.
John Barbour was a very patrician figure, and Blind Harry was a kind of folk bard, although there's nothing folky about his poetry. It's very sophisticated poetry. But he was definitely writing for the popular audience.
And that's the beginning of the Wallace cult.
In many ways it is, because that book goes on being republished and republished and republished. It was one of the first works of Scottish literature to be printed when printing finally came to Scotland in 1508.
The most popular text in 18th century Scotland, for instance, was a retelling of the story of William Wallace, a poem that some people say could be found in most Scottish homes. The only other more popular text seems to have been the Bible.
I mean, I remember as a wee boy driving past Barnwheel near Ayr and my dad saying, "Burn ye wheel, ye barns o' Ayr."
Yes.
Which I think he must have got from the Hamilton of Gilbertfield version of Wallace, maybe via Burns.
Yes.
I don't know where he got it.
Burns was a great fan of Hamilton of Gilbertfield's retelling of the medieval Wallace poem. And so that poem morphs as the centuries pass. And Burns read that when he was a child, was very fired up by it. And it's still one of the poems that powers one of his most famous political songs, Scots Wha Hae, where Wallace bled. As that last word suggests, the Wallace story is a very bloodthirsty one. Blin Hary's medieval poem is pretty relentlessly Anglocidal. So it's the kind of thing that you want to, handle with great care nowadays. I don't think very many modern Scottish poets, whether or not they are in favour of independence, would quite want to sound like Blind Hary.
Blind Hary's a gunfighter. I mean, Blind Hary is a Western, really, by comparison. It's just a succession of bloody battles in which Wallace's mighty swordsmanship kills lots of English people. The interesting thing is, when everyone was complaining about Braveheart, they were all saying, oh, this is scandalous, this is not Scottish history at all. Quite a lot of it actually comes straight from Blind Hary. So Blind Hary was striking a popular chord in his time, just the way Mel Gibson and Braveheart did in our time.
And he goes on to take the folk traditions about Wallace and meld them into a great epic tale.
Absolutely. I mean, he makes a great epic poem. The acts and deeds of the illustre and valiant campion Sir William Wallace, Knecht o' Ellerslie.
And that's one of the things that I really liked when coming to Scottish literature for the first time. The notion that both people at the top as well as the bottom could enjoy the same stories. There was a kind of a cultural continuum. And to have that understanding between audience and author, readership at the top and at the bottom, I'm sure it's not completely unique, but it's a fairly unusual cultural situation to have, not just to have, but to maintain in the early modern period, because I think it goes well beyond the 15th century into the 16th and early 17th.
One of the legacies of freedom being a noble thing is that we have to live up to it. And in the brutal sugar plantations of Jamaica, the Scots got rich by enslaving Africans, the subject of James Robertson's powerful novel, Joseph Knight. Here, one of the anti-slavery advocates, McLaurin, dreams of confronting a pub patriot with some home truths.
Aye, sir, we've aye been hot for liberty. We've fought for it against the English with Wallace and Brus, and we'll fecht for it against the French. It's in our banes, it's in our banes. Of course we'll fecht for the Negroes, sir. We're Scotsmen. It's in our banes. But McLaurin, in his dream world tavern, did not scuttle for safety, but roared back into the oaf's face. You've drunk yourself half blind, man. You see the past, but you didn't see the present. It's Scots that run the plantations, and if you didn't believe me, read Mr. Long's book on Jamaica. Mr. Long, seated in a corner, a yellowish, sneering man with a black beard, raised a glass to him on hearing his work cited. The place is rife with us. Look at the names, you blind beggar, and tell me I'm a leer. He whipped the clute from its place and began to thrash the drunkard about the face with it, a blow for every name. Wedderburn's scalp. Wallace's scalp. Aye, Wallace's scalp. Kerr's scalp. Campbell's scalp. McLean's scalp. Gordon's, Gillespie's, Grant's scalp, scalp, scalp. Robertson's, Ross's, Rich's. Jamaica reads like an Edinburgh kirkyard. And the plantations are a map of Scotland. Glasgow scalp, Haddo scalp, Fort William, Braco, New Galloway, New Milne, Strathbogie, Drummond, scalp, scalp, scalp. The oaf was now a cowering, wincing jelly before McLaurin's righteous anger. Mr. Long was clapping, slowly and sarcastically. The other men in the place continued to stuff themselves. The truth is, we're swimming up to our mouths in the blood of Africans. But when we tack some in, the sugar is so sweeten the taste that it doesn't scunner us. He flung the clute and the last dregs of the man's glass in his face. If you're a true Scotsman, sir, you wouldn't be proud. You would be ashamed.
There's a wonderful poem by Kathleen Jamie that was commissioned by the National Trust for the Bannockburn battle site. It's carved now in a big rotunda around the flagpole there. And it's a poem that makes, as she puts it, a profound bow to Scottish literary tradition and ends by really singing the land in a way that is not militaristic, but turns that tradition of Bannockburn poems into a kind of act of love.
Here lies our land, every airt beneath swift clouds, glad glints of sun, belonging to none but itself. We are mere transients, who sing its westland winds and ferny braes, northern lights and stiller tides, small folk playing our part. Come all ye, the country says, ye win me who take me most to heart.
Come all ye, the country says, you win me who take me most to heart. And I love that.
The poem I wrote and which was chosen for the inscription at Bannockburn is definitely ballad influenced, because that is so Scottish and so of our own history that I thought I couldn't deviate from that in this context. It had to be of the tradition and strongly. And I was quite pleased with myself because I managed to quote several of the older Scottish writers. Anonymous, the great Anonymous of the ballads. Hamish Henderson's in there, and Violet Jacob is in there, and whoever wrote The Northern Lights of Old Aberdeen is in there. So putting these wee fragments together, it was more an act of assemblage than of writing, so I don't claim any great ownership of it. But it looks great out in the landscape there, you know. It's the first time I've seen a poem of mine not actually on a piece of paper, but on a great big piece of wood outdoors, you know. It's terrific. But that's it, it's up there now and it's nothing more to do with me. I'd be very happy to say, right, disassociate my name with it, leave it out in the landscape, and it can become part of the anonymous tradition.
Kathleen Jamie. That anonymous tradition was often female. But the earliest poem by a Scottish woman that we know about was written in Gaelic around 1460.
Her name is Avrich na Corcadel. She was the wife of MacNeill of Gia, and she writes an elegy for him, the first lines of which: Thou rosary that has waked my tear, dear the finger that was wont to be on thee, dear the heart, hospitable and generous, which owned thee ever until tonight.
Elizabeth Ewan of Guelph University. At the same time, a Dunfermline skillmaster Robert Henderson was transporting a classic tale of ancient Troy to an unforgiving Scottish Lenten landscape, where shores o' hail gan frae the north descend, that scantly through the cold a mick defend.
Ain duly season to ain careful dight should correspond and be equivalent. Or as we say in present days, now the kingdoms are united and the court gone south, a dismal season to a woe-filled work should correspond and be much the same. Ah, Robert Henderson, what a falling off is here.
Andrew Gregg, reading from his novel Fair Helen and recalling the opening words of the Testament of Crusade, a masterpiece and a moving human tragedy. Janice Galloway, Rona Brown of Glasgow and Rory Watson of Stirling University.
Henderson picks up after Troilus has abandoned Crusade, and there's a kind of strange rigour to his account, because what he tells us is that Crusade, having been betrayed, abandoned by Troilus, may end up as a prostitute, and for her sins and for her weakness and her frailty, she's afflicted with leprosy. So there's a kind of really harsh fate awaits her.
Both of them think the world is their oyster. They go in separate directions, almost through no fault of their own. But he, should you wish, can be typified as a constant male and she's the inconstant female. I find that much less interesting than just the simple layout of, and you'll never guess what happened after that. It's the telling of a story, and it is the sheer pile-up of misfortune and spite. You can't get away with the spite of the gods in it.
This is Henderson's icy introduction to the vengeful god Saturn.
His face froncet, his lyre was like the lead, his teeth chatteret and cheveret with the chin, his een droopet, how sunken in his heed, out of his nose the meldrop fast can rin, with lippes blay and cheekes lang and thin, the ice shockles that frae his hair doon hang, was wonder greet, and as a spear as lang.
The Testament of Crusade moves with the kind of speed that we associate with Scottish ballads. When Diomed had all his appetite, and mair fulfilt of this fair lady, upon another he set his hail delight. 3 lines, just astonishingly immediate.
You're just asked to take it on trust. This is what happened to this person. That's what happened to this person. Can't tell you why they did it. This is just what happened, and this is how it worked out. And we'll say no more about it at the end, the extraordinary ending that it has.
The relationship between father and daughter is really poignant and really quite moving, I think, when she discovers that she has leprosy, and they weep together and he takes her to the leper house. Really, really emotional stuff.
He looked on her ugly leper face, the whilk before was white as lily flower, wringing his hands oft times said, alas, that he had lived to see that woeful hour. For he knew weel that there was nae succour to her sickness, and that doublet his pain. Thus was there care enoch betwixt them twain.
And she meets Troilus when she is out begging for alms, and they don't recognise each other, but on some spiritual level they do. And Troilus feels all the effects of falling in love. He remembers her beauty, he remembers her love for her. And then it's that moment that makes her realise just what she's done. And she says at that point, nane but myself I'll accuse. The only person I can accuse is myself. It's a beautiful poem really about a woman that's lost everything that she once had. And the story might appear stark, but it's a really emotionally charged poem, I think.
It's the one poem in Scots that I would say is at the level of, say, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, that kind of humanity. Because what ultimately underlines and underlies Henry's achievement is this notion of the tragedy of human loss. That brings us all together, from whichever country or background that we come from.
We'll end with the stark finality of the poem. Of fair Crusade, as I've said before, since she is dead, I speak of her no more. With a 20th century echo of love and regret for an unfulfilled Scotland in the poetry of Hugh MacDiarmid, and with the monument to his love for Cressid, built by Troilus himself in Henderson's noble words.
Some said he made a tomb o' marble grey, and writ her name and superscription, and laid it on her grave where that she lay, in gowden letters containing this resoun. Lo, fair ladies, Cressid o' Troyes toun, sometime coont it the Flouer o' womanheed. Under this stain, late leper, liest deed.
And MacDiarmid actually just uses the same ending.
He uses it almost unchanged. The culmination of the Glen of Silence after this description of the wreckage, the wasteland of modern Scotland, begins, set in gowden letters this resoun, lo, Scotland, Europe's croon, sometime coont it the Flouer o' Nationheid, under this stain, late leper, liest deed.